Have you ever felt like the monsters you encounter in games, become predictable after a while? Like you know exactly what to expect?
Yeah, it's true. It can definitely, take away from that sense of wonder and the unknown that keeps us coming back for more, especially in games like D&D. Actually, you know what? I had this really interesting experience during a recent tabletop RPG session. It really got me thinking about, this whole monster predictability thing.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so picture this, right? My party and we were exploring this really ancient ruin.
Classic dungeon crawl.
Totally. Yeah, exactly. We were expecting, the usual suspects, skeletons, maybe a grumpy gargoyle or two. But instead, we found something completely different, like straight out of a nightmare. This creature made entirely of shadows.
Oh.
It had these glowing red eyes and these tendrils that seemed to stretch on forever.
That sounds terrifying. What did you guys do?
I mean, we panicked, of course. All of our usual tactics, the ones we'd kind of honed over countless battles against, more traditional monsters, they just didn't work.
Yeah.
This shadow creature, it was toying with us, slipping through our attacks and teleporting around the room. And with every touch, it was draining our life force.
Oh, wow.
It was like fighting a monster from a completely different game. I have to admit, it was exhilarating.
It sounds like you stumbled onto a dungeon master who's been reading up on some modern monster design techniques.
Right.
And that's actually a perfect segue into our deep dive today.
Oh, perfect.
We're going to be taking a look at the LitRPG Reads article, How to Modernize Classic D&D Monsters for a New Generation of Players. It was published just this week on January 16th, 2025.
This article is so interesting. It really dives deep into this idea that D&D monsters are evolving. They're becoming more than just, combat encounters.
Right.
They're turning into, fully realized characters, with complex motivations, backstories, and these incredible abilities that can change the way we play and experience these games.
So it's not just about, making monsters tougher or giving them a fresh coat of paint?
Exactly. It's about making them way more interesting, more engaging, and ultimately more rewarding to interact with both in and out of combat. Think about how some of the classic D&D monsters have already evolved over time.
Right.
The article actually has this super cool table that showcases this evolution, which I thought was fascinating.
I was just looking at that. They use beholders, mind flayers, and orcs as examples.
Yes, exactly. And what's really striking is that this evolution kind of mirrors a broader shift in how we approach storytelling in general, right?
Yeah.
The article argues that modern players crave complexity, more nuance, and more opportunities to connect with the game world on a deeper level, on an emotional level even.
So instead of seeing, orcs as just mindless brutes, we're starting to understand, their culture, their motivations, the reasons behind their actions.
Exactly. In the past, a beholder was just this, floating eyeball with a bunch of death rays. But now designers are reimagining them as these master manipulators with telekinetic powers and even, cybernetic enhancements.
Cool.
They're still terrifying, but now there's this layer of intrigue to them, There's a sense that there's more to them than meets the eye.
Pun intended.
Totally.
But that's what makes them more compelling, right?
Yeah.
We're not just fighting a monster. We're facing a challenge that requires us to think strategically, to understand our enemy, and maybe even, question our own assumptions about good and evil.
Absolutely. And this shift towards complexity and nuance isn't just limited to the lore and backstories. Designers are getting really creative with how these monsters actually look. The article highlights some incredible visual redesigns that are both terrifying and beautiful.
Yeah, I was particularly drawn to the section on bioluminescent dragons and cyberpunk constructs.
Oh, yeah. Those are fantastic examples. Imagine encountering a dragon in a dark cave, its scales glowing with this eerie, otherworldly light.
Oh, wow.
Or picture a city that's patrolled by these sleek, metallic constructs. Their bodies are covered in glowing circuitry, and they blend seamlessly with the futuristic landscape.
So cool.
It's like we're seeing these classic creatures through a whole new lens, a lens that reflects, our own fascination with technology, with nature, and with the endless possibilities of imagination.
Yeah. And these visual updates, they're not just for show. They can completely change the way a monster interacts with the world, and even with the players. Imagine a bioluminescent dragon using its glowing scales to create, illusions or camouflage itself in a magical forest.
Oh, totally.
Or, a cyberpunk construct, hacking into the player's equipment, disrupting their communication, or even turning their own technology against them.
That's a good one.
Suddenly, the battlefield becomes a lot more dynamic and unpredictable, right? You're not just facing a monster. You're facing a challenge that requires you to adapt, to think outside the box, and to use your skills in these, like, new and creative ways.
And speaking of new and creative, I was really fascinated by the section on how designers are updating monster abilities to make combat more challenging and engaging.
Yes, that's where things get really interesting. The article provides this really detailed breakdown of all these modern mechanics that are being used to breathe new life into classic creatures.
Tell me about some of these modernized abilities. I'm like eager to hear how they're shaking things up.
One of the most exciting things, I think, is the use of terrain-altering effects.
Okay.
Imagine, like, a monster that can create earthquakes.
Wow.
Or, like, summon storms.
That would be intense.
Right. Or even, like, reshape the very landscape of the battlefield in the middle of combat.
Wow, that completely changes the dynamics of a fight.
You can't just rely on your usual tactics when the ground beneath you is shifting or, like you said, a raging storm is closing in.
Exactly. It forces players to really think on their feet.
Yeah.
Adapt to this constantly changing environment, and then maybe think about how they can use the terrain to their advantage. Or at least how to avoid, being crushed by it.
Right.
And it's not just about brute force, right? Some monsters are being designed with these psychological manipulation abilities, which can be so effective, especially against players who, really pride themselves on their character's mental fortitude.
Ooh, that's a cool concept. So instead of just hitting a monster with a sword, you might have to resist its attempts to, like, induce fear or confusion or even control your mind.
Exactly. It becomes a battle of wills as much as like a physical confrontation. And then there's this whole emergence of AI-inspired tactics, which is kind of freaky.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
Imagine a monster that can analyze your party's strategies in the middle of combat.
Okay.
And adapt its behavior accordingly.
So you're telling me the monsters are getting smarter, more unpredictable, and they're learning from our actions. That's both exciting and terrifying at the same time.
Right.
So no more relying on the same old strategies.
Nope. You'd have to be constantly on guard, anticipating their next move and trying to stay one step ahead.
Wow.
Yeah, and the article goes even deeper, talking about things like layered armor systems where a monster might have weak points that need to be exploited.
Oh, interesting.
There are also mechanics like dynamic energy reserves where a creature's power fluctuates throughout the battle.
Okay.
Creating these moments of vulnerability and then overwhelming force.
So every encounter becomes a puzzle.
Totally.
A challenge that requires not just brute strength, but strategic thinking,
right,
adaptability, and, let's be honest, a little bit of luck.
A little bit of luck, for sure.
What about this concept of adaptive evolution, where a monster can change its form or abilities in the middle of a fight?
Yes. That's a really interesting one. Imagine a creature that starts out as relatively weak opponent.
Yeah.
But as the battle progresses, it evolves, it gains new powers, new defenses. It might even split into multiple forms.
So it would turn every encounter into a race against time. You'd have to figure out its weaknesses and exploit them quickly before it becomes too powerful to defeat.
Exactly. It's like those epic boss battles in video games,
yeah,
where the enemy goes through these multiple phases and each one is more challenging than the last. And all of this ties back to this idea that we're moving away from this purely combat-focused approach to monster design.
Right.
It's not just about how hard a creature hits or how many hit points it has. It's about creating this truly immersive and memorable experience for the players.
Right. It's about making those encounters feel meaningful and challenging. Yep. And ultimately rewarding, whether they end in, a triumphant victory or a narrow escape.
Yes.
But it's not just about making combat more exciting, right? This whole concept of modernizing monsters also has some important implications for inclusivity and representation in the game world.
It really does. It's so important. As we move away from those simplistic depictions of monsters as inherently evil or mindless, we have to be mindful of avoiding harmful stereotypes.
Yeah.
And making sure that, our games reflect the diversity and the complexity of the real world.
The article emphasizes the need to create these nuanced characters with diverse backgrounds and motivations and cultures, even if those characters happen to be goblins or dragons.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond those tired old tropes and cliches and embracing the idea that every creature, no matter how monstrous, has a story to tell.
I love that.
The article specifically mentions like reimagining orcs as protectors of their environment.
Oh, interesting.
They're fighting against pollution, deforestation, maybe even like the encroaching forces of industrialization.
Okay.
That completely changes our perspective on orcs.
It does. They're not just mindless warmongers. They are people with a culture and a history and a connection to their land.
Exactly. And it opens up so many possibilities for storytelling. Imagine the players having to like negotiate with a tribe of orcs who are trying to protect their sacred grove from being destroyed by, a mining operation.
Right.
Or maybe the players discover that the orcs are actually like the victims in a conflict, that they're forced into a war they don't want by some like manipulative power.
That adds so much depth to the game world, and it allows for encounters that are like more than just battles, right? You could have diplomatic missions, alliances, betrayals, or even stories of like redemption and forgiveness.
Absolutely.
And that same approach can be applied to, really any monster. Like, imagine a society of drow that's not just, evil,
Right.
but has complex political factions, internal struggles, and maybe even individuals who are trying to change their society from within.
Exactly.
Or a group of kobolds who are more than just like pesky nuisances.
Right.
They're skilled engineers or inventors or maybe even artists with a unique perspective on the world. Suddenly, every encounter has the potential to be so much more than just a fight to the death.
Precisely. It's about creating a world that feels alive. A world where every creature has its place and its purpose, and where the player's choices actually have real consequences.
Yeah, and the great thing is that all of these ideas, all these tools for modernizing monsters, they're readily available to anyone who wants to use them.
They are.
The article mentions a ton of resources that dungeon masters and game designers can use to bring these concepts to life in their own games. They highlight like online platforms like D&D Beyond and World Anvil, which are amazing resources for creating and sharing homebrew content.
Yes. And these platforms have like totally revolutionized the way we play D&D. You can customize existing monsters, create your own creatures from scratch, or find inspiration from like this vast library of content created by other players and dungeon masters.
Oh, that's awesome. And there are like countless online communities, forums, and blogs dedicated to monster design and modernization.
Yeah.
It's incredible to see how passionate people are about this aspect of the game.
Armor?
Like how willing they are to share their ideas and collaborate with others.
Totally. It really shows the power of like the D&D community, right? This collaborative spirit, this constant exchange of ideas. It's what keeps the game fresh and exciting.
Absolutely. And it's inspiring to see how people are like pushing the boundaries of what's possible with monster design. They're creating truly unique and memorable experiences for their players.
Yeah, it really feels like a golden age for, monster design in D&D.
It does.
With all these tools and resources available, it seems like the only limit is our own creativity. But with all this talk about modernizing, how do we make sure we aren't throwing the baby out with the bathwater? I mean, the classic monsters are classics for a reason, right?
That's a great point. And the article actually talks about this too. It really stresses the importance of finding a balance between tradition and innovation.
We don't want to completely erase those classic creatures. They've been a part of D&D for decades. It's more about evolution than like a complete overhaul.
So we might give a dragon like bioluminescent scales or like a steampunk twist, but it's still a dragon at its heart.
Exactly.
Like its, fiery breath and its majestic presence.
Yeah, or think about the beholder. We might enhance it with cybernetics or give it like gravity manipulating powers.
Okay.
But it's still that iconic, terrifying, floating eyeball with an intellect that rivals like the greatest mages.
Right. It's about taking those familiar elements, those core concepts that make those monsters so iconic and building on them, adding layers of complexity and depth that enhance the game without sacrificing its history.
Yeah, and I think that's where the real magic happens. When you can find that sweet spot between honoring the past and embracing the future, you create something really special, something that appeals to both veteran players and newcomers alike.
And the article also points out that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to modernizing monsters. Like a modernized creature that works in a high fantasy setting might not work in a sci-fi world or even a horror campaign.
Definitely. It's all about tailoring the monster to fit like the specific tone and style of your game.
Right.
Like a bioluminescent dragon might be a benevolent guardian of a magical forest in one campaign, but in another, it could be a bioengineered weapon. Its glowing scales laced with deadly toxins.
Oh, that's creepy.
Right.
And that's what I love about this whole approach. It's not prescriptive, It's about empowering dungeon masters to be creative, to take these ideas and make them their own, adapt them to their own unique worlds and their players' preferences.
It is. And the beauty of it is that even a single monster can be adapted to suit different play styles.
Yeah, that's true.
Like for a group that loves combat, you might focus on creating a creature with really challenging mechanics, layered defenses, and maybe even some of those AI-inspired tactics that keep the players on their toes.
Right. Like a hydra with heads that, represent different elements, each with its own unique attack pattern.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Or a beholder whose eye rays have a variety of effects, forcing the party to constantly adapt their strategies.
Exactly. But for a group that's more interested in, like, role-playing and storytelling, you might want to emphasize the monster's personality, its motivations, and, like, how it interacts with the world.
Okay. Yeah.
Maybe the players have to negotiate, like a tricky deal with a cunning fey creature, or unravel the mystery behind a seemingly monstrous being's tragic past.
Oh, I like that.
The possibilities are pretty much endless.
They are, and that's what makes this whole topic so exciting. It's not just about updating monsters. It's about reimagining the very essence of what a monster can be in, like a D&D game.
It's about moving beyond those simple categories of good and evil and really embracing the complexity and nuance of real-world creatures, even if those creatures are fictional.
And speaking of embracing complexity, the article goes on to discuss how dungeon masters can design encounters that truly showcase the unique aspects of these modernized monsters. It's not enough to just create a cool creature. You have to think about how to present it, in a way that captures the player's imaginations.
Absolutely. And the article really stresses the importance of environmental storytelling. So using the setting to kind of enhance the encounter and make it feel more immersive.
Okay, so instead of just fighting a hydra in, like, a generic swamp, you might stage the encounter in a flooded city.
Yeah.
With the hydra's multiple heads weaving between skyscrapers. Its venomous breath dissolving concrete and steel.
Yes, exactly.
Well, that's so cool.
And you could even use the hydra's abilities to further enhance the setting.
Oh.
Like maybe one of its heads can control the flow of water, creating these like whirlpools or redirecting floods to trap the players.
So it's like the hydra becomes a force of nature, reshaping the environment to its advantage. That would be an incredible visual.
It would.
And a truly terrifying encounter.
Yeah.
And you can also weave the Hydra's lore into the encounter too, right?
Totally. Like maybe this Hydra was once like a guardian of the city.
Okay.
But it was corrupted by like pollution or some magical catastrophe.
Right.
Now it just lashes out in pain and confusion. It's more like a tragic figure than a mindless beast.
It adds like a whole other layer to the encounter, giving the players something to think about beyond just defeating the monster.
Exactly.
They might feel sympathy for the creature, or maybe even have to make this difficult decision about whether to try to help it or just put it out of its misery.
It turns the Hydra into a character, not just like a collection of stats and abilities.
Right.
And that's what's so powerful about this whole approach to monster design.
Yeah.
It's about breathing new life into these creatures, giving them agency, depth, and a meaningful place in the world.
And I think it's also important to acknowledge the role that LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello have played in promoting this idea of modernizing monsters, right? They've been at the forefront of exploring like the intersection of literature and gaming, and they've really helped to elevate the conversation about what's possible in D&D.
They have. Their work has been incredibly inspiring, and this article is a perfect example of that, It's a testament to their commitment to pushing the boundaries of storytelling in D&D. They've shown us that these games can be so much more than just dice rolls and combat encounters. They can be vehicles for exploring complex themes, challenging our assumptions, and creating truly unforgettable experiences.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a question to ponder. If you could redesign a classic D&D monster, which one would it be and what modern twist would you give it?
Ooh, that's a good one. We'd love to hear your ideas, so share your thoughts in the comments below.
And be sure to check out LitRPG Reads for more amazing articles and insights on the world of D&D and LitRPG. Until next time, happy gaming.